What's up, Preacher Creatures? We are so excited to have you here for another episode of the Preacher Creature podcast. I'm Jake Myers. I teach homiletics at Columbia Theological Seminary.
And I'm Ashley Lewis. I'm a ministry professional in the Durham, North Carolina area. Very excited to be here for this conversation today, Jake. So I think this book, it's going to offer so many helpful ways of understanding the particular stresses of being a pastor in this time. And I know that, Jake, you've had your share of difficulties in church, pastoral leadership over the years, some church trauma. Do you want to tell us a little bit about what this book, how this book resonated with you because of those stories?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. It's funny, I hadn't thought about a lot of this stuff in a long time. So reading the book kind of like, not in a like triggering way, but in a kind of like remembering things and wishing that I'd had this resource when I was going through my struggles.
Yes.
So real quickly, I have pastored in two churches. One of them was at the end of college, and then while my wife was doing her master's degree, I served a tiny, tiny church in Henrietta, North Carolina, which is one stoplight, tiny, tiny town. And I came on staff as the associate pastor for youth and children. And it was my first ministry call. And you know me, Ashley, so I went all in.
Yes.
On everything. And things were going great. The youth group started growing, the children's ministry. Like they actually, when they called me, they just wanted me to do youth, but they thought youth was like kindergarten through like high school. And I was like, no, we need to separate these.
Right.
So the ministry was going great, and then they called a new pastor who had been he's passed away now, but he had been like a Southern Baptist evangelist in Texas, and he was like really tall. He was like 6'3", 6'4", really thin guy, and he would wear these like white suits with like the really thick ties.
Wow.
And so yeah, it was kind of like going back in time with him. And I'm just a generally kind of easy to talk to, get along with kind of guy. I try to be pretty friendly, but there was something about me that did not sit well with this pastor. And so I showed up to church one day, and on the bulletin board in the church hallway, there was a letter that was thumbtacked to the bulletin board, and it had my name on it. So I was like, okay, I read it. I opened it up, and it was this letter that was like, how can you stand to like challenge our beloved pastor? He's been the best thing that we've ever had at this church. You know, like you're going to be cursed by God. It was like really, really intense. And,
Whoa.
And here I am, first call in ministry. I'm like, 22 years old, and trying to figure out what had happened. And then there was like a series of these letters that I was just getting, from a church member talking about how horrible I was and I should leave and I shouldn't be in ministry. It was like really, really
Oh my gosh.
kind of harming to me.
Yes.
And one of the youth's parents, one of the things she did, she volunteered as the treasurer. So after every, offering was taken, she would collect the money and things. And I'd shared with her that somebody in the church was really upset with me. And so she pulled me aside and said that she knew who had written the letters.
Oh.
And so it turns out it was the senior pastor.
Wow.
Who was sending me these hate letters. And the reason we figured it out is because he used a typewriter for everything, even typing his checks. And there was like a little defect on one of the letters that was the same in the letter that he wrote and also in the checks that he was, doing for his tithe. So this came to light, and then I was back doing children's church one Sunday, and I heard shouting and screaming, and I was like, gosh, what's going on? So he preached this like hate sermon, like basically like, church, you choose. Do you want this horrible, good for nothing youth pastor, or do you want this amazing man of God who's, been called to serve you? And then he walked out. He just left the church. And so then they had a session, Baptist, it's like, okay, well, let's gather together and figure out what we're going to do. And the people were rightly really upset about everything. And so I figured, okay, this is going to be the end of my time here. But as people were asking questions, different people in the church had seen him act out against me in private, for different ways. And so then they kind of rallied around me and said, okay, he wants to leave, that's fine. And they decided to keep me. And
wow.
And then just amazing, providentially, the chair of the religion department at Gardner-Webb University, where I went to undergrad, he had been a pastor for like 25 years before he went back and got his PhD. And he was really my mentor who just, I owe so much to him.
Yeah.
He came to this church as the interim pastor.
Wow.
And for a year and a half, he was there kind of helping them to heal from it and also helping me to heal.
Yeah.
And then the church called a guy named Travis Smith, who is to this day one of my best friends. He was a classmate of mine at Gardner-Webb. And he oozes pastoral care. And so it was just so healing. So I was there for about 5 years before I moved to New Jersey for seminary. So I kind of healed from that a little bit, which was great.
Thank
and then my second one, because you can't have one, you got to have multiple traumas, right? Out of seminary, I started working at a really large church in my denomination here in Atlanta. And they had called me as the associate pastor for alternative worship and missional community.
Okay.
So my charge, so the church had like 20 years of infighting. They used to be the largest church in the denomination and the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. And in fact, in 1991, when Paige Patterson was running for the presidency of the Southern Baptist Convention, the former pastor of the church where I was serving was the person running against him. So it was kind of like, this was the moderate voice and the other one was the really conservative voice, and the conservative voice kind of won out. So there used to be like 5,000 members, but they just started kind of turning on each other and were fighting. And so when I got there was maybe like 1,500 members or so. And my charge was to help the church kind of return to this like outward focus, like this missional kind of calling to like use its resources to help those in the community. So I kind of revamped the mission programs. I led international and national and local mission trips, got people more engaged in local ministries in Atlanta. And then my other charge was to start an alternative worship service. So the idea was to create a kind of a church within a church that would be intentionally designed for people who had been hurt by the church or had no church experience. So we made it really clear we had no interest in stealing people from other churches to come to our church. And it was very experimental, really fun, very life-giving. My psychologist wife tells me that I have a middle finger complex, and she's probably right on that front. Thankfully, I think it's better than it was when I first started in ministry. But there was a couple of church folks there who, had been like CEOs of major companies, and now they retired. And in hindsight, I realized like they needed people to like boss around, and unfortunately, sometimes as pastors, we can kind of be the punching bag for people to work out their own issues. So I had some kind of conflicts with some people, and at the time, I had long hair. And they hated that, and I would I did like theology on tap kind of conversations in the community, and the vestiges of Baptists, like Baptists, like we don't drink beer, we don't go to movies, we don't play poker. Like it was, even though, gosh, I couldn't tell you a Baptist that I know who would follow all those rules now, but it's kind of that old school approach. And so the church that we started within the church we called it Rechurch. And it was growing, and new people were coming, people were getting baptized. It was really great. And like it felt like we were firing on all cylinders, and we were starting to plan a second worship service for Rechurch. But then this was in like 2008, and the economic fallout from the lending crisis kind of hit hard at our church, because we had so many like retired multimillionaires who tithed off of the earnings from all their investments. And so when those went down, they stopped giving. and they were really kind of upset with what I was doing and what the senior pastor was doing, so they started withholding their tithe checks. So I marked the beginning of the end the Sunday that we had more people in worship in Rechurch than they had in the main sanctuary service. And so shortly after that, I was leading a mission trip in Liberia, and the senior pastor went with me, and he took me he said, let's go for a walk. And so we were walking, and he said, if you have an exit strategy, you probably need to find it. And
that's a tough conversation.
Yeah. I mean, I appreciated the heads up, but thanks be to God. I got into Emory, I applied, and it worked out perfectly. So I was able to kind of transition relatively seamlessly.
Yeah.
But so when I left, there were 9 pastors on staff, 9 full-time pastors. Within a year, there was 1 pastor left. Wow. And the only reason he was there is because he had cancer, and this was pre-Obamacare. So he would have an existing condition. He wouldn't have been able to be insured.
Wow.
So that was really hard, and I still have issues like when I'm worshiping in a church and there's like this closed door like coup attempts that they have. It's really, really triggering to me and to my spouse, who in some ways it's harder, I think, to be the spouse of a clergy person who's going through this, because you see your partner suffering and you don't really have the power to do anything about it. So that's me.
Yeah.
and I remind my students sometimes when I'm talking about this stuff, I was like, there's a reason why I'm a professor now and not a pastor any longer.
Right.
For whatever that's worth. That's my experience.
One thing that's come up for me in this book, listening to you talk, and in preparing for our conversation with Jim and Carol is the role that conflict strategies play in how, again, just like how all of these situations play out, and in how we can learn from one another as we hear stories about conflicts within our contexts. Because, for example, one thing that helped me so much, and I know it wasn't the first time I learned about this conflict strategy graph, that I'm not going to be able to recall the source of it now. I should have prepared better, but I remember seeing that avoidance is a conflict strategy on one end of the kind of spectrum of ways to engage conflict. Avoiding is a strategy, as well as a kind of more escalated, more emotion-fueled engagement of a conflict. And so sometimes we think that if we avoid a conflict directly, or avoid taking on a certain kind of more direct approach to conflict, that we are not participating in the conflict or getting out of it, or will escape the repercussions of it. But really, avoiding it's still a conflict strategy, and it has its own repercussions. It can be used just like any other strategy at the right time. And yet, when we hear from folks who have a different approach of leaning into conflict, of taking it on, there are also ways that can go wrong. But sometimes using a different conflict strategy than our innate one can be to our advantage. And then learning how to manage ourselves through it is something that, and who our support systems are through that, how we take care of ourselves through it. Just learning to take care of ourselves in the midst of all of this is one of the lessons that I think it has to just come with time and with age. And yet there are ways that we can help that along if we're aware of it, that isn't always part of our pastoral training. And like for me, looking back over my adult life, my first career, but also seminary, I heard people saying these things about taking care of yourself and these tools and strategies to practice the self-reflection and the introspection. And I heard them, but I had to go through my own process of kind of crisis and pain and emotional maturity, and honestly have situations like circumstances in my life open up space for it that I didn't necessarily want to carve out, but circumstances and maybe the Spirit cleared the space for me. Mm-hmm. And then when I really stopped and thought, what does it mean to, how can I engage these practices of self-reflection and introspection if just like sitting in a chair in my living room in the dark and thinking to myself isn't really that's not really my speed. Whereas, for example, my husband would do that happily. I walk into a room and find him sitting in the dark because that's just how he naturally reflects. And for me, that's not going to be effective, but it is crucial to find our own ways of cultivating that introspection. And then I realized I actually don't know how to really care for myself. When something goes wrong in life, do I know how to turn inward and say, what do I need? How can I learn to cope with what just happened? How can I be okay, even if there are people and situations around me that would maybe wish in this moment that I was not okay, but I'm actually allowed to take care of myself when other people aren't necessarily going to offer that care. So anyway, that journey looks different for everybody, and yet sometimes it's easy to put it off for far too long. And I think a lot of pastors and just culturally, a lot of folks do. And so a book like this, conversations like this, and hopefully the community that we are hoping and helping create through Preacher Studio for Renewal can help folks either continue that process when they need it most, or maybe even start it for the first time. So yeah, thanks for your stories and what that brings up for me too. So yeah, this conversation is going to be so great with Jim and Carol. The book that we're going to be talking about today is called Wounded Pastors: Navigating Burnout, Navigating Healing, and Discerning the Future of Your Ministry. And it's published by Westminster John Knox. So our authors, James Fenimore is a psychotherapist and congregational consultant with the Samaritan Counseling Center. He's based out of Bedford, New York, and he has served as a pastor and a district superintendent in the United Methodist Church, a wide array of experiences and qualifications to be speaking on this subject. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist in New York. He holds a degree in technology, theology, and psychology. And then he ends up really pursuing projects that merge these areas of study. And we see that reflected in the book.
Yeah. And then the other author is Reverend Carol Howard, and she's an ordained pastor in the PCUSA. She's the author of Healing Spiritual Wounds, Reconnecting with a Loving God and Experiencing a Hurtful Church. And she's also the author of Reframing Hope, Vital Ministry in a New Generation. And she's also written 2 devotionals and is a popular speaker for preachers and church groups. She's contributed to the Christian Century and a lot of publications. And I had the pleasure of getting to know Carol very well because she was on our inaugural pilgrimage on the Camino de Santiago for the awesome. Preacher Studio for Renewal. So it was really just such a joy to journey alongside her and to hear about this book and everything. And I'm so pumped that we're getting to have them on the podcast.
Yeah. And there's this tinge of bittersweetness in a conversation like this and in a book like this, because it's not the kind of book that can be written from a detached, far off, protected place. I mean, those might exist in our imagination, but they rarely exist in reality anyway. And this book is an example of the lessons that are hard learned and hard won. Yeah. And they've come from their own difficult stories, their own circumstances that showed the need for this kind of book and this kind of work. And so we are especially grateful for the wounds that they bear, that they were able to come together, find community in each other and in their own support systems, and then give the church a book that is so timely and so needed. So let's Let's go ahead and bring them in and turn to that conversation now. I think we're in for a real treat.
Yeah, let's do that. Jim and Carol, thank you so much for joining us today. We are excited to have this conversation about your new book, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say about it.
Thank you so much for having us. It's wonderful to be here.
It's great being here. Thanks.
We so appreciate your time. So you write about the difficulties of being a pastor in this particular time, this age that we live in, and with anxiety levels in churches through the roof and concerns about the future, it's tempting to try to live up to every congregant's demands or particular congregant's demands of what they think a pastor ought to be and do. So how are pastors supposed to live faithfully following their call during these tumultuous times that we're living in? It's such a big question, and also a good place to start to set our conversation up.
Yeah, you're exactly right. There's so many things that we're being hit with right now. I mean, right now, pastors are supposed to be not only preaching on Sunday morning, taking care of people, but also we're supposed to be, running nonprofits and counseling and doing pretty intense mental health issues right now, dealing with those in the congregations. And there are so many things, we're supposed to be tech experts and marketing experts, and we're supposed to be, we're just being pulled in all of these different directions. And oftentimes we'll sit with our personnel and they'll tell us, we need to be out in the community, and we need to be in the homes with parishioners, and we need to be in our offices.
Right.
And so you're just sitting there thinking, how? How do you do all those things? And these are all things that I love to do. So I have a particular issue with wanting to, be all things to all people. And I love my work so much. But at some point, you have to just stop and realize that where your calling is. We are called to, especially in Presbyterian circles. Jim, you can tell me what this looks like in Methodist circles, but we're called to, preach. We're called to administer the sacraments. We're called to faithfully lead people in spirituality and discipleship. And that may take different forms. But at the end of the day, that's the heart of the matter. And so being very, very careful and clear about what our calling is. And then if we want to, go on these little side excursions as we wish, we can. But we need to, and churches also need to have better boundaries and better expectations of who their minister is and what they're called to do, because we shouldn't be expected to be all things to all people. While our expectations have increased both during the pandemic and also during this time when we have had just difficulties trying to figure out who we are as churches, many times our staffs have decreased as well. So it's like our job description just keeps getting bigger and our staffing just keeps getting smaller. And so, we might be a pastor who is also copying off the bulletin and doing all these things that much larger churches expect, but we're only one person.
Right.
So it's important to recognize this, understand what's going on, being able to communicate it to our churches, and being able to just go easy on ourselves, understand that we don't have to do everything.
Yeah.
In the United Methodist system, we have a book of discipline, and there's a description of what the pastor's role is, and it goes on for pages and pages and pages and is way too detailed. it is really hard, because that just makes us anxious about, what are we going to do? How do we do all of that? And our own anxiety is, we have to think about it as a whole system. And so the whole congregation is very anxious, and each one of those people bring in that anxiety.
Mm.
And nothing raises anxiety more than the death of a system.
Wow.
And so
Yeah.
as churches continue to struggle to survive, the anxiety level is spiking to be crazy. And so even though we're anxious and trying to figure out how do we do what we need to do in a congregation, we have all of these leaders and congregants who are incredibly anxious. And in a way, they're taking it out on us as pastors.
Yeah.
They don't know what to do.
Right.
They're scared. And, when we talk to them, we realize all the things that are going on in their lives, and it's being brought into the congregation. And so in a way, there's often a response that is to kind of micromanage and control what a pastor's doing as a way to find control in their own lives that are out of control. And that maybe if we do our job right, the church won't die.
Mm.
And so I've never seen, like in churches in my 30 years in working with churches, never seen the level of anxiety across the board so high. It's a really difficult time.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're talking about like kind of everybody experiencing that anxiety, but one of the things you name so poignantly in the book, and I've experienced existentially, is this sobering truth that some church folks, especially who are maybe a little unhealthy, they have this knack for finding the points in our lives that are the most traumatic, and like putting pressure there. And you helpfully label these trauma triggers. So the question I have is like, how do we open ourselves to offer care and support to our congregants and parishioners when doing so exposes those raw nerves that we instinctively strive to protect?
Yeah, I don't know what comes first. Like, I don't know if people just do 20 things and one thing really sticks with us and really hurts and makes us reactive, or if people like just kind of instinctively, I think some people do have that knack of just knowing what's going to get under your skin.
Sure.
I don't know how that happens. It's the magic of being human, I guess. But or for some humans, but it does, it happens. And I think what's really important for us is we can't control that person. We can't control whether or not they're doing it intentionally. We can't control whether they're trying to hurt us. But what we can do is we can control our own reactions. And first, we have to identify it, because we may be, coming home and yelling at our kid when our kid didn't do anything wrong. And, you might be thinking, where did that come from? So you have to understand our reactions, which takes oftentimes a lot of journaling, a lot of meditation. If you're a visual person, maybe collage, making a collage. But what you want to do is you want to understand where that reaction is coming from, and kind of build trace that thread from the current situation to maybe something that happened in your past, maybe something that has occurred repeatedly in your churches, but try to figure out what that is. So, for instance, if you have a reaction um, to the budget and it comes out, and anytime there's a hint of a deficit, everybody's anxiety raises, and you start, really, really getting anxious about it. Begin to think about, like, how did your parents handle money? What did they do when there was scarcity in the home? How were you taught to handle scarcity? And things like that you can begin to kind of understand where that threat is coming from, where that trauma is coming from. And, I know we maybe even overuse the word trauma in some cases. And I'm not saying that, you've been embattled or gone to war or whatever. And there is like PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, disorder, but sometimes we just have those stressful events in our lives, those bruises that people kind of touch on that we need to be aware of. And whether you think that word is overused or not overused, just be aware of those times when you begin to react significantly to seemingly small events and figure out where it's coming from.
That's good.
My first full-time appointment was as an associate. And one of the things that I learned from the senior pastor was this, when people would do that, kind of attack her or go after her, I was kind of surprised at her response, because what she would do is immediately like make an appointment to go to their house and have a conversation with them.
Wow.
And I'm like thinking, no, I don't want to have anything to do with them. I'm just going to, back away. And it was this sense of kind of like counterintuitive, that rather than pull away, which is sort of what would be the natural response, it was to go closer and build relationship. It's really, really hard, I think, to do that. But what she was able to do is to build those relationships, and I think to have empathy for the person and realize that there's something else beyond it, that what is happening and those buttons that they're pushing is not because of us, but because of something going on internally within themselves.
Yeah.
Not everyone I know can see that, but it's really hard, and it's hard for us to get to a place when we can open ourselves to do something like that, and to kind of be vulnerable enough to allow that.
Well, speaking of vulnerability, I so appreciated the attention to that concept in the book. You note that as pastors, we cannot be vulnerable with everyone all the time. And yet there is a need to access and to, lean into that vulnerability at certain times. It's so tough to negotiate when to be vulnerable, when to guard ourselves, how to do both potentially, because we are vulnerable creatures. We have needs too. And we want to relate, to the tender needs of our congregations at the same time. But they don't always deal so well with their pastors' vulnerabilities, or that of our families and our own difficult situations in our lives. So the pastors in the book whose stories you share really demonstrate well how challenging these kinds of relationships can be. How did you move from listening to their stories to offering the practical advice that you do in the book when some of these issues are so complex? I know our listeners would probably love to receive some concrete guidance on handling communal vulnerabilities when we ourselves are often wounded, and it's hard to do that in the moment. So what wisdom can you offer on this front?
I wish I could offer like really simple techniques and tricks to be able to do that, but I think it's much more complicated. My own training and background is in Bowen family systems, and so I have been studying that for a couple of decades. And what it does, what I find for it, is that it gives me a framework to understand what's going on. What is the system like? Treating the whole church as a system, not as a bunch of individuals, but that it's almost like a puzzle, and everyone has their like shape and their way that they fit into that puzzle. And you could take one of those pieces out, but the puzzle will reform in a way that it fills in that missing piece.
Yeah.
So it's not simply about getting rid of a piece of a puzzle. It's so getting an understanding of how that system operates, what's going on, what are the dynamics of it, is really, really helpful. But then it's really trying to figure out, how do I we call it being self-differentiated. How do you be able to, in a sense, be outside of all of that that's going on? Because when we can get to that kind of position, we're no longer reactive and just like a knee jerk, almost a primal kind of way in which we operate. And we're attacked, so we attack back or we run away or whatever it is. We actually can be responsive in a way that we can think through, this is what's going on, this is what's happening. How can I affect a more positive change on the system as opposed to allowing it to stay in where it is? It's really, I wish it was easier. I wish, I guess we'd be able to sell a lot of books if we had those kind of answers. But
yeah,
it's not. It is kind of like a lifelong project. And, that's the piece is not so much about what we do with others. It's more about what do we do for ourselves? How do we continue to be in a space in which we can not take on all that anxiety and then react to it, but we can actually, in a way, almost put up like a force field that can not take it on. I mean, that's a boundary that's really, one that is really important. Is how do we have a boundary of not accepting the anxiety of the system?
Yeah, boy, that's hard to do sometimes. And talking about vulnerability, you two are both very vulnerable in the book, and you share a lot of really excellent case studies of other pastors who had dealt with these different kinds of issues that were wounding to them.
Yeah.
And one that really struck me was a pastor named Chloe and her experience during COVID. And you just named so poignantly what I saw so many of our alumni at Columbia's Theological Seminary writing to me, help, how do I do this? How do I do that? And, it wasn't just the pandemic and all the extra load that was put on pastors, but the political divisions that the pandemic really exacerbated. And so you named something quite profound when you talk about the way in which in-person, loosely structured gatherings such as coffee hours and potlucks can kind of function like an emotional release valve. They can kind of let some of the pressure out of the system. But with COVID, we lost those spaces where we could, as you say, rehumanize one another. I love that phrase.
Yeah.
So can you talk to us a little bit about the role of multiple emotional systems and their impact on preachers' emotional, mental, and physical health?
Yeah, during this time post-COVID, we know sociologically, people are telling us that we've lost those third spaces. We had home, we had work, and then we had that third space that we would go to. Sometimes it was church, sometimes it was a coffee house, a place where we were able to go to the gym and work out or go to the dog park or whatever it was. There was that third space. And, Robert Putnam, he talks about bowling alone, of course, but it's like that that movement got even worse. And so people are stuck in these isolated positions. And when we're isolated and we may only be on social media, or we have very limited contact with people. Yeah. There is a way in which we dehumanize each other. There is a way in which those politics become more polarizing and the fear of one another heightens because we don't have that chance to come back together, to think with each other, to struggle with one another and understand each other in those profound ways.
That's such a great point. And even if there are some of those third spaces left, they've changed. They look different. They're metered differently. And we've talked a bit already about this need for both the relationality and the boundary setting, the vulnerability, but also differentiation. But I wonder if we could talk a bit more about those healthy boundaries that we all, should seek to maintain, because you share some really helpful wisdom about the idea of boundaries in part 2. There are a couple great quotes. I'll read one that just says, in boundary training, we think about what the church needs, but we don't always think about what we need as the pastoral leaders. We don't learn how to keep boundaries around ourselves to protect our expectations, relationships, beliefs, and identities. And you speak a little bit later saying, like, somewhere between bleeding over over compliance and hardened withdrawal, we can find a way to maintain healthy boundaries. They give us stability to remain emotionally connected to our whirling congregation while maintaining a solid sense of self. These were quotes that really stuck out to Jake and I as super helpful. Could you share more with our fellow preacher creatures about how you've seen transformation happen through the setting and maintaining of healthy boundaries, especially amid these difficult times, sociopolitical, economic, environmental struggles that so many of us are seeing in our churches?
Absolutely. My work now is as both a psychotherapist and as a consultant with congregations. And part of that work is I do a lot of boundary training because it's a requirement for most denominations that clergy go through that. And I think it's one of the most difficult things to deal with because clergy are going into a system that is highly resistant to boundaries. And it makes it really difficult for them to go in and then try to set boundaries.
Right.
Because they're going to take a lot of the heat for that. So what we've been trying to do is kind of refocus some of the boundary training and offer boundary training also for laity, for church leaders and for personnel committees or session or various other groups that are in leadership, because they need to see the value of what boundaries are. Because if you go in and you say, I'm going to have I need to have at least one day off a week, and I'm going to have a sabbatical, or I'm going to have all these things. They start to say, well, what are you talking about? And or if you say, I'm not working in the afternoon in the office because I have evening meetings, and they're like, I'm working all day, and then I'm going to the meeting.
Right.
Why is this appropriate?
It's a great example.
So helping laity to understand the kind of stresses and the pressures, and also what the benefits are for basically having self-care. Laity should learn it too, not just for the pastor, but for themselves. How do you establish boundaries in your own life? How do you take care of yourself? So much of the boundary training that I'm doing now is much more focused on clergy self-care than it is on the do's and don'ts. Because quite frankly, I rarely come across clergy that will openly violate any of the boundaries and do things that they shouldn't be doing in ministry. What happens is that what I do find is clergy who have become so anxious and so burn out that they get to a place in which they don't make good decisions.
Yeah. That's a great point.
And it's if when it shouldn't be focused on what you shouldn't do, because we know this. We all know what we shouldn't do. But we need to figure out, how do you not get to that place where it is absolutely overwhelming and poor choices come in because what else am I going to do? And that's the sad part. And like I said earlier, it's one of the most important boundaries is not taking on the anxiety of the system and finding ways to keep that, because in order to be effective, in order to continue to function in a way that you're not reactive, but you're responding to the situations, you do have to figure out how to not take that on, because anxiety in a system is highly, highly contagious. It's so easy for us to take it on. The triangles, all the things that are happening, the scapegoating that happens, and we get the sabotage that's happening. We can easily react to all of those things and just spike our own anxiety and start just going ballistic. But trying to get to a place in which we can work at ourselves and understand that we don't have to take this on, and that we can be functional individuals.
Yeah, I think like the flip side for me is I've been working with clergy, victims of clergy sexual misconduct through, I'm a head of a committee. And so I have been looking at these cases a lot where clergy uh, have done some things that are on the do and don't list, or definitely on the don't list. And so, at first it was like I would roll my eyes and think, oh, these entitled men who are pastors, and then I started realizing like my friends getting in trouble, or, like then I began understanding, wait, there's something going on here. There's something happening. And so what's going on here? Instead of me just rolling my eyes and thinking this is our big Me Too movement, and these people are wielding power, which is part of it. It's also why is the sexual misconduct happening? And it didn't make sense when people would say, well, I was so stressed out I had to have an affair, because it to me it just seemed like, well, if you're struggling with time management already, then why add an affair to the mix? but
Yeah.
but but the more I got into this and started realizing that oftentimes when our anxiety and our stress is so high, we need that release valve. We need that, sense of joy and that source of excitement that an affair would bring. So, I would struggle with Jim a lot with this, like, why is this happening? What's going on? And that's when he would often say, well, is there a way in which we can make it so pastors don't get to that point? And it seems like that needs to be more of the focus, or at least as much of the focus as, this sort of normative idea that when uh, a minister is having an affair, it's because a male minister is trying to have some sort of sexual power. Um, saying that still happens, but there's something else happening too. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it does.
Yeah. Absolutely. And I just sat through a 3-hour boundaries training. I'm an affiliated minister with the PCUSA, and they didn't take this angle. So I really appreciate kind of naming that. Because I think it's easy, like in the whole internal versus external locus of control, to kind of say like, oh, that person abused their power and harmed somebody because there's something like fundamentally flawed in them, rather than recognizing this like whole system of stress that, could lead them to do these things. So it's a really helpful way to reframe it.
Yeah.
Appreciate
And
that.
I think, as a former adjudicatory executive, I mean, I knew that the basic reason why we had boundary training was because the insurance companies required it. And it's really, checking it off that this person has gone, they know what they shouldn't do. They sat through 3 hours of that.
Yeah.
And, so there isn't any requirement really to have that in there, I think. And so I do believe that what I'm seeing in the denominations is that there is a sense that we have to take advantage of this to be able to help clergy, as opposed to forcing them to sit through something that is really not helpful for them. And that's, I applaud the adjudicatories that do find that that's important, and are trying to change and shape that up so that it's not just a check that person was there and sat in that, as opposed to we're trying to help them. At the last one that I dealt with, one of the examples that we were talking about was retired clergy who are kind of interfering in the churches and going back and having issues with that. And we took that apart, and one of the responses that came back from a small group that was talking about this was, what can we do to help retired clergy with this transition, because it's so difficult to move where all your identity and all of who you are comes from a congregation. And if you stay in the community and you come back to the church at some point and try to help out, how do you navigate that and still be able to feel okay about yourself? Because retired clergy, it's such a difficult transition. And what we usually do is have them sign off on this covenant that says, I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to do that, I'm not going to do this, whatever. What about helping them be able to navigate, giving them some guidance and some help, not just about what the pension is and how to get your pension, but how to navigate the internal issues as you move from one to another.
And maybe even defining what that kind of role and relationship could look like that's healthy, and allowing that differentiation to happen a bit from the role that they previously had. I think that's such an exciting idea, and a great take on it. And I think it applies culturally so much as folks are sorting out what retirement from all kinds. I mean, so much of this conversation is bringing to my mind how the church is really mirroring the other social and cultural tensions that we are experiencing in the broader, world, and even thinking that these things are just happening within our churches, and so we can just handle them in our churches, I think further isolates and sort of situates the church away from other aspects of our life, when really we know that these things are so integrated, and they can have maybe more of a permeable relationship between how these things affect us in other schools, workplaces, and kinds of social spaces. So yeah, this is exciting work and conversation for many, many reasons.
Yeah, and it dovetails perfectly with the kind of work that we're excited about here at Columbia Seminary. We've started what we're calling the Columbia Theological Seminary Preachers Studio for Renewal, and the renewal piece is really key. And in addition to being able to host this podcast, we're creating two restorative renewal kind of experiences for preachers. One is every January for the next 5 years, we'll be offering a yoga and mindfulness meditation kind of retreat in El Salvador. And then the other one is that every June, we'll be leading a 2-week pilgrimage on the Camino de Santiago. And Carol, it was so wonderful to have you in our inaugural pilgrimage last June. I really enjoyed getting to know you and kind of hearing more about your story and the struggles and joys that you're experiencing. Talk to us about the importance of pursuing outlets to cultivate pastoral and personal reflection, so that we can discover healing and to discern the future trajectory of our ministries.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely want to give a big plug for the Camino trip, and I'm definitely going on doing the yoga excursion for sure.
Awesome.
Yes.
So really, really looking forward to that. And I was right in the middle of, all kind of tumultuous stuff happening in my personal life and in my professional life.
Yeah.
And it was kind of at the height of all the stressors, and right when I had no business taking 2 weeks off, which ends up being kind of 3 weeks off, and I just thought, what am I doing? Why in the world am I doing this? And a couple times I thought about just turning back and just sending in, just saying, I can't do this, keep the money, whatever. But then I went, and it was just incredibly important. And not only did I have a space where I was able to talk to people and kind of had to talk to people, and just tell the story over and over and over again. but there were these wonderful, amazing people who were listening and not interrupting me. And we had all day. And there was something about feeling the pilgrims ahead of me, just knowing that I was on this path that had been walked for generations and generations. And you could feel sort of this, kind of the spirit of those who had been there before, and all that they were bringing, that need for healing, that need for wholeness on that path. And so each step just became extremely poignant. So thank you, Jake, and everybody else who made that possible. It was just really, really an incredible experience for me. And but it absolutely reminded me of the importance of being able to take yourself away from these highly stressful situations. And whether it is a change of scenery, or if it's just finding a monastery, finding, I had to find another space where I could worship, and other places where I could talk, or but when we're in these difficult times, we don't have the time for taking care of ourselves. It's like the last thing we have time for.
Yeah.
But it's the thing that we need the most. So we all know that, but we forget it when we're in the middle of it. So if you're finding yourself in this highly stressful situation, number one, know that you're not alone. And number two, find a space where you can remind yourself that you're not alone.
Yeah.
That's great.
I mean, it is so important to get outside of the system, and it does give you perspective, and it does. I mean, it's almost as if there's like this anxiety force field that exists when we're there, and we feel it. I mean, we sometimes we can go into just go into the church and immediately start to have this physical reaction to what's stress, and you feel it all. But to get out and to do something like that, and to prioritize that, I mean, is very hard, but it really is. And churches are not often going to be supportive of that, but it really, really, really is important to kind of get those moments to be able to. That's the building of the self-differentiation. That's the understanding of what's going on, and getting that reflection and getting that time apart.
That's awesome. Jim and Carol, thank you for writing this amazing book. Preacher Creatures, make sure you read this book.
Yes.
It's one to have on your shelf. You'll probably return to it time and again, just to kind of refresh yourself on the ways in which we need to care for ourselves as preachers and pastors. Jim and Carol, it's been so great to have you on the podcast. Thank you for your time and for your wisdom. And gosh, this was such a blessing for me.
Thank you. I appreciate it.